they didn't need to understand what it means to be Muslim in India. They could understand what it means to break down a person from the inside like this. And that's when I recognized that the story of marginalization in India is much bigger than one event of violence. It's a sort of ongoing, decades long project.
Hello, you're listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian, where we speak to celebrated authors and emerging literary voices from across South Asia. I'm your host, Shwetha Srikanthan, Associate Editor at Himal Southasian, coming to you from Colombo. And here with us today is the writer, producer, and educator, Zara Chowdhary, joining us from Madison to talk about her memoir, The Lucky Ones. On the 27th of February 2002, 2 train carriages were lit on fire in Gujarat, claiming the lives of 60 Hindu right-wing volunteers. The chief minister of the state at the time, Narendra Modi, called the burning an act of terror. The next day, raging Hindu mobs poured into Gujarat's streets, looting, raping, and burning alive the state's Muslims. The massacre continued for 3 months. Within 3 weeks, more than 2,000 Muslims were killed, and by the end of 2002, more than 50,000 Muslims became refugees and survivors in their own country. In 2002, Zara Chowdhary is 16 years old and living with her family in the city of Ahmedabad. Instead of taking her board exams that week, Zara is put under a 3-month lockdown, with her family and thousands of others fearing for their lives as Hindu neighbors and members of civil society transform overnight into mobs, hunting and massacring their fellow citizens. Modi will later be accused of fomenting the massacre, and yet a decade later will rise to become the Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy, fueling the rise of Hindu nationalism across India. Zara's memoir, The Lucky Ones, is a reckoning with this past that feels all too present today, and is an affecting ode to the women in her family. It is about the refusal to allow the violence that tore Gujarat apart to be forgotten or repeated. It's a rebellion of a young Muslim woman who insists she will belong to her country, family, and faith on her own terms. Zara, welcome to the South Asia Review of Books podcast, and thank you so much for joining us to talk about this incredibly moving book.
Hi, Shweta. Thank you so much for having me.
To start us off, Zara, tell us about how The Lucky Ones came together as a full memoir from a collection of essays, among the first of which I believe is one titled Slow Violence from the 2021 anthology New Moons, Contemporary Writing by North American Muslims, in which you write about the destruction of your father's career in the rapidly changing Hindu fundamentalist regime of Gujarat and the impact this had on your family. When did you know you wanted to document these stories and experiences?
That's such a great question. Thank you so much. So, the first thing I had told myself when I started to write professionally in India was that I would never write about myself and that I would never write about my family. I've always escaped into fiction. It has felt so much easier to embody the stories of others, to act out the conflicts of others. And yet, when I came to the US for my MFA and I was trying to write speculative fiction, and I went a whole year struggling to find the thing that I wanted to write. And then I went away on this residency the first summer that I was here. And, I came to a very small town in America to study, to do grad school, which was right in the middle of America, cornfields as far as the eye can see, big blue skies, but no ocean. And for me, the just living by the ocean has been this sense of freedom and this sense of healing that I've always needed. And so that first summer, I was very lucky to go off on a residency on the East Coast, and I was sitting in front of the ocean there. I was taking a poetry workshop, actually, which strangely, I've always found poetry is the most generative form for me. It's a form that draws from my gut. It doesn't draw from my brain. And so when I was sitting there and just being asked to write something that was mildly autobiographical, that felt true in some sort of childlike way, I ended up writing this little poem. And I hesitate to call it a poem because I'm not a poet by any means. But I called it To the Men Who Trouble My Papa at Work. And so it was the sort of direct address piece in which I just took off and I started to write to these invisible men who had been my father's colleagues. My father had worked in the Gujarat Electricity Board, so the state utilities department, for a career of more than 20 years, from when he first came back from the US as a young man, having studied here, to, just a few years before he passed away. And so his whole adult life was given to this organization. And my one enduring memory of those years is of a man who would come back home from work completely decimated, who would be this sort of destroyed husk of what a man should be, what dignity and pride in a man should feel like. And he would come home, he would pour himself a glass of whiskey, and then a second, and a third. And then I write in the poem, and my house would go up in flames, and my father would turn into a dragon. And what that really meant was that everything that he would have had to endure through the day for being a Muslim and being a Muslim government officer would turn into this sort of trickling, distilling violence at home. And as I wrote this piece, I could feel a sort of spiraling anger and rage in me and in my body. And by the end of it, I remember in the original draft, I call the men bastards because I feel that mad and I feel that sort of deep rage for these people who have destroyed my home and my father. And in subsequent drafts, I really sat with that rage and I asked myself, well, if this isn't slow violence, then what is? And so that poem actually became the essay that was in the anthology that Kazim Ali edited and sort of picked this piece for. And I think it's when that I read that whole essay out for the first time to a room full of white people in Ames, Iowa. And I saw the response where they didn't need to understand what it means to be Muslim in India. They could understand what it means to break down a person from the inside like this. And that's when I recognized that the story of marginalization in India is much bigger than one event of violence. It's a sort of ongoing, decades long project. And what people are enduring on a very cellular level in India goes beyond the fires and the looting and the burning. So that became sort of the beginning of recognizing that something was just forcing its way out. I used to keep saying this in Urdu to my mom, like, mere halak mein kuch atka hai, something is stuck in my throat. And I needed to first bring this out so that other writing could follow.
In this memoir, you display such a steady and intentional hand in writing about the violence that unfolded around you during 2002. Tell us about the importance of recording the horrific acts committed against Muslims, the accounts of Bilkis Bano, Ahsan Jafri, Madina Sheikh, and the complicity of the state and the horrific actions and inactions of political figures, including the then Chief Minister Narendra Modi. Tell us about the process of bringing these stories together along with your own.
Well, first, when you're living as a witness or a survivor, you're already living with this highly flattened identity. You're not being seen in your full, whole human self anymore. And I think one of the reasons I think of us as fortunate or lucky in some ironic way is because just in the act of having full bodies and having left that place in some way with, our physical intactness, we were still fortunate enough to be seen as full humans. But people like Ehsan Jafri or Bilkis Banu or Medina Sheikh have become really the sort of like the broken parts of what happened through those days. There's stories of how, somebody was mutilated, somebody else was raped, somebody else's daughter was murdered, their children were decimated in front of their eyes. And so when that becomes your whole story, it becomes hard for those of us who've never endured that sort of debilitating, crushing loss to even imagine them as full people. And for me, that became the exercise. That sort of became my mecca of, if I have to make this journey of pilgrimage as a writer, I have to first sit and try and delineate the shape of their being before the thing that happened to them. And before this horrific 3-month period, there must have been fuller lives. There must have been richer, quirkier, sillier stories. There must have been opportunity for laughter. There must have been room for empathy and relationships and ties with a community, with a land. And so filling in those shadows became my one job and obsession. And so even when I was thinking of Ehsan Saab's story, for instance, what I ended up going back to were the little pieces, where his grandson remembers how he used to save these little sparrows that would home in the roof of their house in Gulbarg, and how this child who's come in from America, who's just, sweating buckets in Ahmedabad's summer, is begging his grandfather to just turn on the fan. And the grandfather says, no, there's chiriya, there's chaklis on the top, and we have to protect them as well. And so it's those little things. There was this beautiful instance that his daughter relates at a speech or a rally somewhere that I was listening to, where she talks about how she and the other children in the neighborhood, when they were really young, would get together and collect all the little leaves and bits of paper from their homes and surroundings and make little fires in the winter. And to think that, these children were playing with fire in these little courtyards once upon a time, and the thrill they must have felt, and how much agency they must have felt to, get together and do something dangerous and something naughty. And that 20, 30 years later, their parents are burnt alive in that same neighborhood. And that Nishreen, Ehsan Sahab's daughter, must then walk through this charred neighborhood and see the ghosts of that life that she used to have there. So I think walking through those decades with them helped me to then tell a much fuller story, because we've all been people before the worst thing that happened to us.
From the powerful story of Bilkis Bano to Amma and to yourself, motherhood is such a central part of the lucky ones. You think of Bano and her daughter when you hold your own child, and you write that, and if I may quote, mothers who hold their dead children in their arms, they grow to carry a weight of hollowness constantly with them. They may force themselves to mold new smiles, new dreams, new children around that hollowness. I will learn this when I learn of my mother's loss and the price she paid to have me. End quote. Tell us more about this powerful theme you've woven across this memoir.
Right now with just watching the horrors in Gaza, one of the things that I keep thinking about is how if mothers ran this world, it would be a very different world. And just a few days ago, I saw somebody somewhere write this, that the reason some of us are in so much pain even right now, watching what is happening, is because a mother knows, and not just a human mother, an animal, a seed that bursts, anything that has to rip itself open to make life happen, and makes life happen at the cost of the destruction of self, that is a power like nothing else in this world. And I do think that it took me becoming a mother myself, and in many ways, sort of, because I had my son at a time where I wasn't fully ready or prepared or knew what it meant to be a mother. And at 23, I remember that sense of this just shook up and opened my body and ripped me open in a way that I had never thought my sacred and sanctimonious body could be. And when I sort of transpose that onto my own mother, but also then push myself to transpose that onto people I don't know, onto the stranger, which is Bilkis Bano, which is Medina Sheikh, which is any mother in the world that has had to feel that sense of loss and then has to also see a world around her child burning. It really reminds you that to make life is so much harder than to destroy it. And that sense of void that I talk about, it's a void that I think any person that has birthed from their body can tell you they carry within themselves as a sort of haunting. And, we have all these medical terms of postpartum depression and all of these other ways of thinking about it today. But there's a certain feeling of literally seeing your heart live outside your body. And so when I think of that moment when this mob descended on Bilqis's 3-year-old daughter and took a rock and crushed this child to death in front of her eyes, what must that have felt like to know that this thing, not only did I carry it, but I made it from my bones. Babies leach calcium and blood and iron and all of these things from your body, and then you have this thing that's living outside of you. And to know that you made this thing and how easily somebody crushed it, that to me was a moment in which I really question God. I question existence. I question why human beings were ever allowed to have such power. And so for me, that became central in many ways to the story, because motherhood is also about agency. And it's about knowing that if you can give birth, you are also here to course correct. You are here to build pathways. You are here to show the world what the imagination of a better world can look like. And I think in so many ways, the fight for justice that Bilqis has especially carried around for 20 years and more, the things that my mother did and the very small acts of agency that she showed to navigate this dense and often difficult world we were growing up in, and to bring us out through it. Those are the little acts of agency and truly to me acts of mercy. We would be lost without them.
Before we welcome you to present a short reading from The Lucky Ones, I'd like to take a moment to invite our listeners to check out Himal's Patron program, where you can pay to support our mission to give South Asian literature the spotlight it deserves. To make conversations like this possible, we need the support of listeners like you. Southasia Review of Books is now a bi-weekly podcast and a monthly newsletter that ties together our latest reviews, literary interviews, and publishing news. You'll find a special reading list curated by Zara Chowdhary in this month's edition, so do sign up for the newsletter to keep up with our latest reviews, podcasts, and more. And while you're at it, please do also check out Himal's State of Southasia podcast hosted by Associate Editor Nayanthara Narayanan, featuring conversations on pressing social and political issues from across South Asia. Now, Zara, over to you to read an excerpt from The Lucky Ones.
This is from a section further down once the violence and the riots have started, and it's called How to Grow Flowers in a Bedroom. When Misbah and I shut the door of Amma's bedroom that evening, we look at each other conspiratorially. We switch on the tape deck and allow ourselves grace. Grace is the only language Misbah and I know to speak in. It has been our shared tongue as sisters since before we ever learned how to walk. We don't yet know what it means to save each other, but we know something happens when we dance. We feel redeemed. We have done this each evening from the moment we started to walk, from the moment we recognized our world burned like clockwork each evening. We insert our favorite tapes one after another, hits from 2001, Lagan, Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum, Dil Chahta Hai, Aks, Lajja, Nayak, Pyar Tune Kya Kiya, Zubeda. We haven't watched all the movies. Papa takes us to the theater only for the big ones. But song after song we go, moving and making the movie with our bodies. Through the moods and bhavs and rasas of each song, we make up steps and build facial expressions. We construct entire lives and love stories filled with heartbreak and mischief and sublime joy. Amma slips into the room in between dinner preparations to watch us. A few times Dadi and Puppu peep inside too. Appa sits on the bed, arms folded, her grim mouth slackening into a smile. There is nothing to dance about right now. But in C8 Jasmine, there seldom is. Dance is the only way Misbah and I know to transcend this reality. When Amma comes in to watch, I watch her back. as she leans her tired body against the linen closet, her smile building from her thick lips to her honey eyes. Soon she's clapping with our every shimmy and shake. She lets out a soft hoot. This is all she can do. Dance is teaching us what she can't, mustn't, that we have power, that as long as we have each other, our souls will be okay. She watches us bloom amid all this smoke, gracefully stretching into life, grateful we are hers, thankful we are alive.
Thank you for that beautiful reading, Zara. In The Lucky Ones, you unravel so many of these layers of what it means to grow up as a young Muslim woman and how this society often pitted sisters and friends against one another. And despite having so much in common, living in the same ghettoized neighborhood, this sameness started to wither and turned into an internal ranking system almost of who was more pious or who was the better Muslim. So, how did the events of 2002 and its aftermath shape your relationship with Islam?
Strangely, it did very different things to my sister and me. I think always been the sort of memory keeper in the family. And I think the memory of what faith meant to my family and the different ways in which, even within this one household, all of us had a different relationship with Allah, with the idea of Allah, is something that I carried in my body a lot, just in a greater quantity, I think, than my sister, who was much younger when we had to leave. And so at some point, once we left and we, in a way, promised to never look back, she also left some of those remnants of faith behind and then went through a phase where she really questioned her relationship with Islam. I think for me, because I carried this memory of my grandfather who took us to every dargah in Ahmedabad every Thursday to go say salam, or I carried, this smell of the incense that my dadi would force me to go light in front of all of these pictures of Sufi saints around the house that in itself is frowned upon in some Islamic communities and others, do it. And so there were just such strange contradictions within the same household. And I say this in the book that one of the reasons we think of ourselves as so fortunate is because we had grandparents and parents from 4 different parts of India. And so each brought their own flavor of Islam into the house. And so for me, it was this richness that I was refusing to let go. And if anything, over the years, looking back, looking at those years, I think I always go back to the memory of how centered and grounded and safe I would feel sometimes just on the Janimaz. In fact, I start the book with me stepping onto a Janimaz. And when I think about that little rectangle of cloth as a site, and mean SITE, site, I think of it as a site of safety. I think of it as a space within a household where there is no space for safety. There is no space for thought, for aspiration, for dreaming of what you could be outside of this apartment, outside of this ghetto, outside of this city. There is only this big black hole when you look into the future. And yet, when you stand on this little rectangle piece of cloth and submit in this wholehearted way to this unknown, unseen, unheard of figure or God, you know that you are seen and you feel like you belong. And so, in a place where such unbelonging surrounds you, it becomes almost empowering to know that this is a thing nobody can take away from you. And I find that again something that I see today in Gaza, which I find it echoing so deeply with me when people have lost everything and they're being blown to bits and they're sometimes carrying their children in little plastic bags. And yet all they say is Alhamdulillah and they say Hasbanallahi wa ni'mal wakil, which is that God is my witness and I need nobody else because God is my witness. And so it becomes this act of witness, which is so central to Islam and it is so central to my being as a human that if my only purpose in this sort of strange existence that we all share is to bear witness, then how do I come at that one job with all the integrity and all the devotion that I can muster. And that has become my central sort of tenet of being a Muslim in the world, but also as a Muslim writer, as a Muslim woman, as a Muslim thinker. And a lot of this does come from those early experiences of intense othering and that intense unbelonging that was shoved on you by society.
Speaking of faith, one late afternoon in 2002, with your friends and family, with the world ending outside Jasmine Apartments, you watched Mustafa Akkad's film The Message for the first time. Cinema usually mocks and parodies Islam, but through Akkad's lens, faith is depicted with dignity. The film also brings a moment of hope in such a horrific time in your life. Tell us a little bit about your professional background in film and about the impact that films like The Message have had on your life.
I love this question so much. I can talk about film all day. I mean, you saw even in the little piece that I read how much our sort of cultural education was so narrow. It came really through what we lived and what we saw. And even though we were a family that had, had the opportunity to access higher education and convent schooling and all of those things, I think living in this very ghettoized world, our world had definitely narrowed down to whatever cinema played on Doordarshan, the tapes we could buy. And so that became the first window for us to access emotion, the first way to think of romance, to think of comedy, to think of divine intervention, to think of ideas like reincarnation, And so I'm a huge like Manmohan Desai fan, and I've, grown up on Amar Akbar Anthony, and that's my way of going back and grasping and holding on to an India that I recognize at a time when it's just in this flux and changing into a thing that I don't sometimes get. I also did, yes, I really took off when I was 19 or 20 to go work in films first, started as an assistant on a set and became an assistant director and then worked in production and did a bunch of things for a decade almost in India. To me, the magic of cinema in India has always been the fact that there's just so many dimensions allowed. We don't lock ourselves into genre. Or we didn't. Classically, we have never done that. And that's why I mentioned bhavs and rasas and, this knowledge that is so inherent to all of us. Our films come from an understanding that life has a little bit of everything. And that sort of interwovenness and interconnectedness of song with literature, with poetry, with folklore, with mythology, with, weird technology. I think that sort of strange palimpsest that we create and we call cinema is a wondrous thing. And I love that it's a unique form and format that India still holds. And which is why the world looks at us with this strangeness. I think for me, as a student of cinema and as somebody for whom it has always been this sort of magical technology that has allowed me to transcend my reality, watching Akkad's film, even in that moment, I remember exactly how my body felt when I realized that he has done the thing of not depicting the Prophet Muhammad as an actor, as an embodied being in the film, and that he has used cinematic tools of the fourth wall and of the camera being the point of view of this character to show you that this person existed, but because our faith, in some belief systems of the faith, they don't want you to depict his being, his likelihood, his likeness. We're going to use cinema and we're going to use craft. And so it was this weird appreciation for craft for me as a child happening in a moment when there's a mob on the street, But that's why I think I've gravitated towards art all my life. It has allowed me this little sort of underground tunnel to sort of jump into and get out from under the thing that threatens to kill me. And in many ways, it's why I've chased after that feeling all my adult life, that high of knowing that humans are capable of this sort of ingenuity.
I'm glad you brought up art and ingenuity, actually, because I would love to hear about the significance of the book's cover. It reflects the beautiful stories of Muslim weavers and Ahmedabad's rich textile craft traditions, which you thread together in the book. Tell us more about this.
A lot of this actually is stuff that I always had an instinct and an understanding of from having lived in the space, but I did not have a full historical academic understanding of it. And I think writing the book gave me an opportunity to really immerse myself in that world and recognize the long history that Ahmedabad has. And this goes back actually to the founding of the city. So it was built by Ahmad Shah, the Badshah of the Gujarat Sultanate, who, named the city after himself. It's built all on the eastern side of the river first to start with. And so, like a lot of these sort of ancient Indian cities, it's a place where merchants and traders and artisans from across the country, the land, of what is South Asia at the time, sort of just travel through. And it's a city that is marked by these beautiful darwazas. So you have these, I think, 14 or 16 doors facing in each direction. They're just beautiful and ornate and welcoming. They're not these imposing sort of fortresses. They're these gorgeous, tall doors that you enter and exit the city from. And it's a place that becomes a vibrant hub for different forms of block printing and of weaving cloth and just art in a way that the human hand is just on its most sort of exemplary display, and what we can do with our hands. And so growing up, all I knew was that my mother couldn't afford to take us to a store and buy us ready-made clothes. And so we just went to Teen Darwaza and Thalgarwar and these places where this cloth was all hand block printed. There was just reams and reams of textile and fabric. And she would sit there in these little dukans for hours, not just haggling, but like pulling out every color in the world and matching it with everything else. And a lot of that initial understanding of aesthetic came from my mother doing this, who she was an artist, but she was an artist who was not allowed to practice her art in our household. And so she did this. She went to the bazaar and she matched the shalwar with the kurta and the dupatta. And so in many ways, she treated my sister and me like canvases. And she treated everybody around us like a canvas. And she's like, I think this will really go well with this for you. And so those places and the way they smelled and the way they sounded and the way the vendor sounded became my sense of Ahmedabad as a child. And so when we were talking about this cover, especially because the book was coming out in the US, and I remember, looking around me at references when they told me, just walk into a bookstore, see the things that call out to you, but also like amongst Asian, South Asian memoir. I saw that a lot of it was depicted the way Americans see us, which is, usually the colors of holy. So there's just red, orange, turmeric, yellow everywhere. And I was just like, well, that's not my understanding of Ahmedabad, and that's not my world. And then I remember having this beautiful opportunity to sit down and talk to my book designer, which is a rare gift. It doesn't happen in publishing anymore. And Arsh Raziuddin, big shout out to Arsh. She and I, as we were talking, I started to tell her that, when you are forced to flee a place that you grew up in, and your whole sense of childhood is left behind. And when I say childhood, Americans love material memory. When you read American memoir or like even when you look at the way Americans write about memory, there's a lot of material memory. Things are marked and objects are looked at as little holders of that day when I was 5 and I buried this thing in my yard and so on. What do you say to a refugee? What do you say to a person whose house burned down? How does somebody whose mother was raped and mutilated and killed in front of them have any appreciation for material memory? And so, in saying those things, I remember that I started naming things that were important to me. And I remembered, for instance, the school uniform we used to wear when we went to Mount Carmel, and how when we moved from one school to the other, our friends would scribble little messages on it to, wish you good luck and whatnot. I remembered little journals in which I wrote my first early, very bad poetry. I remember the little scraps of cutouts from magazines that I used to stick together in little folders that my dada had collected from his sales tax office. So there were just all these strange things that one day were just not my things anymore. One day I was on a train and I left the place and I never saw these again. And so as I started to recount this, Arsh asked me, she said, do you have any pictures of your mom's saris or dupattas or things that really speak to you as, or a thing that evoke your mother for you? And I said, I'll do you one better. I actually have some of her dupattas and I'll just take pictures of them. And so this one Bandhni dupatta I took a picture of, and I specifically thought of the fact that Bandhni comes from Gujarat. That again, think of how much love goes into tying each knot and dipping it in color and making patterns of flowers and birds and nature and the natural world and telling these elaborate, rich stories, right? So that sort of love for what Indians and South Asians make with hand is a thing that I carry in the absence of actual material memory. And so when I said that to her and I sent her this picture, I think something just clicked and it all sort of came together. She loved this idea of what happens when you sort of rip through memory in that. And there's a tear in that psyche of the survivor. And you have especially young people and two young girls looking through it. What does that world look like? And so there's a certain complicity that you feel when you see these two girls staring at you through this torn fabric. And I think I wanted that. I wanted the book to hold the reader accountable in a way. And I don't know how Arsh did it, but she somehow did.
It's beautiful to hear the thought and care that went behind this cover. I'm so glad I got to learn more about this from you. And Zara, tell us about the journey of excavating your paternal grandfather's past. From only knowing the fact that your family came from Gurdaspur in Punjab, and also the significance of names and the linguistic and cultural diversity of your family, which you explore in The Lucky Ones.
So my grandfather lived in Gujarat through my whole life. And to me, it felt like Gujarat and Gujarati culture was sort of the overriding culture in the household because my grandmother was very much from Ahmedabad. But it was in these little snatches of time that the Punjab would peek through, when my grandfather would hear music on either the tape or on TV, and there would be like a bhangra or gitta, just a song playing, and he would just stand up and start hopping. And it was such joy to see him do that as a child. Or when he would be writing these letters in Urdu, and I couldn't read Urdu, which is, the irony for a lot of Indian Muslims. You ask them, and there's this big division between Hindi and Urdu, and we're told, oh, Urdu is your language. And most of us actually only read Hindi. We can't really read Urdu. But my grandfather would write in this excellent penmanship, and I wouldn't know who he's writing to these letters to, but I could see from the address that these letters are going to Pakistan. And later, I actually found out that he was writing Punjabi in the Nastaliq, the Urdu script, to his family who were in Punjab and Pakistan. And so it's this incredible layered history of our subcontinent's past that comes through in just one man's story and just one man's struggle to be able to connect with a family that was split when this terrible sort of artificial division was created by the British. And so the Radcliffe line actually went right through Gurdaspur. This is also a thing that I discovered only in the writing of this book. And again, I did that exercise of sort of standing there and imagining myself on a land where suddenly a crack develops across it. And suddenly you're told that that half is not yours anymore. And you must only stay here. And the fact that his mother and his siblings moved to Pakistan, like a lot of people did, because they were promised land on the other side. And similarly, people moved to India from that side because they were told that there would be homes and lands waiting for them here. And so these are the sort of like stories that get lost in time and the sort of minutiae that we don't feel encouraged to look for in India. We're only told stories of blood and gore and violence. But to me, what was just fascinating also about this was how when 20 years after the partition, my grandfather receives this letter from his mother, who's now in Pakistan. She doesn't speak in some sort of quote unquote like Islamic language or, Pakistani language. She evokes the Ramayana. She tells him, even Ram came home after 14 years of exile. I haven't seen you for 21. To me, that moment seems so telling of this shared life that we have all lived as South Asians. The fact that this woman sitting somewhere in now, a new country is able to think of this shared mythology and call out to her eldest son, who now lives in India and has a whole family of his own and a life that she has not been able to witness. And so, in telling that story and recreating those little scenes, I really started to have this deep appreciation for how much we are losing with each generation and how much of understanding is just not being passed down to the next and the next and the next generation. Of the fact that to be Indian Muslim, to be Indian Hindu, to be Indian Sikh, to be Indian Buddhist, these are multi-layered things. In between these two very sort of solid and sort of stuck layers, there's layers of language, there's layers of poetry, there's layers of soil and geography, of textile, of handicraft, of family feuds, of caste. There's just so much packed in between that we don't always get the luxury sometimes to sit with. And I think it was my deep privilege to be able to sit and unpack some of this. But it was, these little snippets of snatches of things that I just heard in the air as a child growing up in this household that when I sat to really investigate showed up as a spectrum, really this sort of abundant richness of stories that I never thought I had inherited. I felt so at a loss and so dispossessed. And yet, when I sat with just the fact that my grandfather spoke about his sister who died at a dargah, at a shrine in Pakistan, that I remembered suddenly how our one Pakistani uncle told me the story of the person whose shrine she was at. And I didn't remember it. And then when I sat to write my Dada's story, I was just, it was literally the most random Google search of like Punjabi Sufi saint poets. And I started from there. And I found the first person that showed up was Baba Farid Ganshakkar. And these two lines somehow seem to call out from the book of, where he talks to his lover, to his beloved who is far away, and he must cross a mucky street to get to her or them, and says that this is the irony of my promise to you. This is the pain of my vow to you that if I walk the street, I could possibly come to you, but then my coat, my robe will get stained. And that became my grandfather's story, that if he needed to reach his sister and his brother and his mother, he also had to perhaps then carry the stain of mixed loyalties, of perhaps being disloyal to this nation state and wanting that one that's an ethno-nationalist or an ethnic identity of a state. And those conundrums are deeply felt by a lot of Indian Muslims, especially North Indian Muslims. And I felt all of those things as I was telling his story. And then to be in touch with a Pakistani relative as I was writing this and to ask them, do you remember the shrine where this, aunt, my grandfather's sister, died? And they tell me, yes, of course, it was Baba Farid's shrine. I mean, imagine the sort of serendipity of those things, right?
That's incredible, Zara. I can't imagine what finding that would have felt like. And it was also incredible to read about Dada's story. It's almost like a history of the subcontinent told through this individual, and that was beautiful to read. And Zara, you write that, and if I may quote, some days when it feels like my motherland is forsaking me, telling me I am not hers, she is not mine, and my soul wants to cry like an orphaned child, I remind myself that my belonging was bequeathed to me by the best of mothers, my Amma. End quote. This is reflected beautifully in the dedication to the book as well. Tell us about overcoming this sense of unbelonging within your own home and India, and maintaining the love that you have for a family and a country that forsakes you and your community.
Wow, that is a big question, and it's a question that really, I think it's a thought that, draws me to tears every time, because this idea of knowing that you don't belong at first, sort of takes seed in the child's heart in a flat in Ahmedabad. To just know that even within this family structure, between these different units, you don't seem to belong, that they don't see you as theirs. I think it's why I'm able to analyze and sometimes almost analytically look at the unbelonging that I feel, or that a lot of Muslims in India feel today, from that lens, because there's a very deep understanding from a child's psyche. Because I happen to be growing up in this very strange household where daughters were not seen as belonging. And so it's that sort of, gift that nobody asks for, of a viewpoint that suddenly starts to inform and starts to frame how you see India's current reality. But for me, I think this idea of what my mother was able to instill in us, the fact that the place, the geography, the people, the community that you come from don't have to become who you shape yourself into, that you always have agency, that you choose your ancestors, you choose your elders, you choose the people you want to model yourself on, was also something that really only got strengthened with time. And I think having the opportunity to leave Ahmedabad after this moment gave me even more of that sense of empowerment, that India has innumerable heroes for me to learn from. They don't have to be my father and grandmother and aunts and uncles. I could learn from poets. I could pick, anti-caste heroes. I could pick people who have fought truly against colonialism from a sense of equity, not from a sense of nationalism or sort of religious fundamentalism. So I have freedom to choose who those heroes should be. Just because I grew up in a school system that tells me Gandhi and Bose and, these are the photos on the wall and you just have to somehow bow to them unquestioningly, that sort of complete submission to fixed and stagnant stories, I was able to remove myself from that and say that I don't have to live that way. And that freedom is something that I do think was constantly instilled in this refrain that my mother carried throughout our childhood. And I think that that's a love that I hold for people. I think I've started to truly reframe what my love for India means. My love for India is for its plentiful, natural sort of environmental beauty that was just bequeathed to us. We did not earn any of it. We've just been so lucky to be born in this place, right? And yet we've completely decimated our natural environment in this greed towards capitalism and towards wanting to be like the West. But in the same time, what we have in our people, especially most recently, was in India. And I remember everywhere I went in the rickshaw, every corner you turn in India, there's a little, community center with Ambedkar's photo. And it says, oh, learning center from this time to this time, or tuition from this time to this time. And this sense of collective action to collectively raise each other and each other's children. In college, I was very lucky to work at Anganwadis for like one whole semester as a student. And again, the way that these women who are not being supported with the food systems that we should be having, who don't have the resources to educate these children with the materials they need, are giving off themselves. There is a deep, deep generosity that we are capable of and a deep empathy that really predates nationalism, that predates colonialism, and it is something that comes from the land. And I deeply believe in this about India, about Pakistan, about Bangladesh. I think South Asia, we have had a civilizational opportunity to really evolve into these beings because of the many histories that have crossed paths across this land. And I do think there is a richness that we are all capable of, a generosity, a magnanimity that we're all capable of. But we've so easily and so often given into these lesser, beings, this sort of, I talk about this in the book in terms of jihad, that there's two jihads you can do. There's the lower one, which is where you fight for community, you fight for faith, you fight for, and in many ways that has become a way for people to think of supremacy, to think of one group really overcoming and taking over and dominating another. But there is a greater jihad in Islamic theology, and that is the one within. And it's when you start to really turn on the inside, on the self, and ask of the self true accountability, and ask of the self true generosity, true expansion of that human spirit. And I think that if anybody, it's us in South Asia, we're capable of it. And I have to believe in that to go forward.
Absolutely. And Zara, what was it like to go back to Ahmedabad Jasmine Apartments in 2012?
I think to stand in front of Jasmine from the footpath and to look up at the eighth floor to look at those apartments was both, I think, a humbling and an empowering experience. Because on the one hand, I was standing in front of this thing that had just withstood so much. It had withstood one of the biggest earthquakes the region has ever seen. It really was filled for decades with generations of multicultural families, of cosmopolitanism. It was one of the last standing places in that part of Ahmedabad where people of every faith lived and lived together harmoniously. And so there was definitely this humbling sense of how lucky was I that I got to grow up in one of these last places where we didn't stop a delivery guy at the door asking him his faith. We didn't put a watchman at the door to stop somebody based on their caste. There was no separate elevator for somebody who you consider, the maid or the lesser other. So this was a place that had free flow for humanity in a strange way. And where do we see that anymore in high rises and in these like gated communities in India, right? Who have we become? So even in 2012, there was this increasing sense of value for what we used to have. But at the same time, I think this was also a place that had deeply scarred and scared me as a child. And to me, I used to think of my family and the people I grew up with within that apartment as these giants. And, how when you're considered so tiny and so inconsequential, everybody else seems to tower around you. And you feel you're almost at knee level looking up at the world. And your vision cannot even capture the bigness of this thing that scares you. And suddenly everything felt very small because I'd had the chance to go away and fill myself and raise myself in many ways and become this adult and come back to it. And so to look at the building and to look at everybody else, everything seemed to have shrunk in the way that age shrinks people. And so I felt both this sort of loving sort of tenderness, this care for this thing that had shrunk and it's almost like the building had become my elder in some strange way. And in a strange way, it also felt like it couldn't scare me the way it had when it was more vital and more alive. And so I think a lot of what people call now forgiveness and grace in the book, which really to me is time tempering some of those more primal feelings that we all come to our stories with. I think time did that for me. And to go back and stand there that many years later and look at it, it was the strange, overwhelming mix of both of these things of deep, deep love and reverence for the place that made you, and also a strange disaffection of saying, it's okay, I can be a little more than this.
Just last year in India, a school teacher encouraged a Hindu middle schooler to slap his Muslim classmate as the child sobbed helplessly. Around the same time, a Hindu cop shot Muslim passengers on a train and walked away. Young women in hijab are banned from entering their own schools in India. 11-year-old boy was stripped, paraded, and made to chant Jai Shri Ram before he was lynched on the street. Tell us about how much of The Lucky Ones is a product of these times, and how it resonates with the rise of Hindu nationalism and anti-Muslim sentiments in India today.
I think when I hear and read of these instances, these incidents coming out of India, a strange sort of like iron door goes down in front of my heart. It's this strange locking away of hope for another day, because then all I feel is rage, and all I feel is this immediate fire in my belly to want to intervene and stop. And so this book is in many ways me sitting with that intervention and saying, if all I can do is right, how do I pack all of this fire in my belly into one book and offer it to everybody, but very specifically offer it to that child who has been slapped, offer it to that girl who is being told, you cannot be a full student and take your exams and have a career and a life and a future. How can I offer it to that child whose dignity has been taken away from them in that moment and say, here, I am with you, I have got you, you are not alone. And so for me, it became this action of, I am not able to put my body in front of this harm and in the middle to directly stop it. But there has to be two things that I can do. One is to show complete and absolute solidarity with those who are facing this right now, which is so much worse than how it was for me growing up in Gujarat, where yes, there was the mocking. Yes, there was the calling names and labeling. Yes, there was the 6-year-old kid who looked at me as a 13-year-old and say, oh, you're wearing a green t-shirt, it means you're Pakistani. You know, those scars are nothing compared to the scars that are now being affected to the psyche of Muslims with the demolitions and the constant harassment and the lynching and the daily news of lynching. What does it do when, you speak to African Americans and you speak to people in other parts of the world who have had those long histories of prolonged histories of lynchings, and you will start to see how their DNA changes, how their very way of behaving and looking at the world around them changes. And that is the terrifying thing to me, to see that reality right now. But I also want this book to do the other thing, which is to remind the onlooker, the bystander, and really turn the light on them and put our gaze on them and say, what are you doing in this moment? What are you seeing? Does the thing that you see differ so greatly from this thing I see that you freeze rather than act, or that you cower away in fear rather than show up? And what will it take for us to remember that we are capable of this collective action, that we're capable of collectively holding each other accountable and then holding these forces accountable? And so it's why this book has had to do so much of heavy lifting, because it's trying to carry the memory of who we used to be, and it is trying to hold accountable who we have become in the same space.
Absolutely, and I think this book shows so much of that solidarity and the importance of speaking up. The Lucky Ones, to me, speak so powerfully to what literature can achieve, where mainstream media often falls short or rushes to move on and forget. So we'd love to get your reading recommendations for other must-read books on the 2002 Gujarat massacre, works that recall and unpack these darkest moments of India's recent history.
Well, the struggle in putting together this list was that it's a very short list. There just isn't enough literature out there when it comes to Gujarat. There is incredible reporting. There is very brave writing, including, Rana Ayub's Gujarat Files, and I have Dion Punsha's Scarred right here that really became just so important for me as I went through it, to remember each street, to remember each name, to remember the sound of the language in which the violence was justified and the words in which people mocked the victim. So, in that sense, some of these books do some incredible work in just documenting and putting together, just writing these things back into history and writing against erasure. But while I was writing this book, I think I mostly ended up looking at either personal first-hand testimony, so bits and pieces that I could get of folks like Nisreen Jaffrey, or what Bilkis Banu has said, what her husband has said, and so sort of taking from those recordings. And there's a few pieces of sort of what I would think of as literary journalism, where folks have written to report, but then they have imbued it with a lot of soul. One of the pieces that I really want to shout out to was by a young academic and scholar who wrote this incredible piece called Burying the Massacred in the Shade of the Kalandri by Hiba Ahmed. And Hiba writes about the cemetery where these mass graves exist in Ahmedabad, and how these nameless parts of Muslim bodies were just buried with whatever dignity we could afford at the time. And so it's pieces like that that really brought together my memory of this time and place. But in terms of just the sort of Muslim writing that, I thought I'd give you some of that, just give you like Muslim writing, which in this generation, we're just finally coming into our own again after a big gap of this sort of blunt force of being told that all you are is a minority, you are uneducated, or you just don't have the words or the temerity or the skill to write in the same way, even though so much of South Asian literature stands on the shoulders of, Muslim literary giants. And so I just want to name a few people whose work has really spoken to me. There's a student I work with here, Dia Abbas, who's a poet, Ikra Khan, who's a poet, Sanam Sharif, Shami Ali Naeem. These are all incredible poets. Faisal Mohiuddin. There's a journalist, Zahir Jan Mohammed, who's done some incredible work on reporting about Gujarat, but also just writing of what it feels to be a Muslim in this time. In terms of older, sort of ancient poetry that, you would think of as Sufi poetry, I think Wali Gujarati's poetry, Baba Farid Ganshakkar's poetry, but also the words of, Majru Sultanpuri and Shailendra and Sahir Ludhianvi, which became the ethos of modern India through Bollywood songs and through their ghazal and nazm writing. Those are voices that I would again encourage people to go back and listen to. There's two female writers who I'd love to shout out to. There's Shubhangi Swaroop, whose Latitudes of Longing just reminded me of the India I saw after, of, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands and of the Himalayas and the sort of natural beauty of who we really are, the sort of sweeping lands that we have all inherited and should care for. Taran Khan's Shadow City, where she walks through Kabul as a woman. And it really showed me how much character and role a city or a place can play within a story. And then Valmiki ji and Jacinta Kerkata's poems have really, really sort of grounded me in the truth and reality of who we are as a society, not as a nation. So these are just some of the names, and I'll send you the whole list.
Zara, thank you for the brilliant conversation and those excellent reading recommendations as well, and for taking the time to speak with us today about this incredibly moving memoir. It was a pleasure to have you on the podcast, and many congratulations again on the book.
Thank you so, so much, Shwetha. This was so lovely, and I can't wait to speak more. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian. This episode was edited by Ritika Chauhan. If you like this episode, please share widely, rate, review, subscribe, and download the show on your favorite podcast apps. You can find Zara Chowdhary's reading list for the episode in this month's Southasia Review of Books newsletter. You can find the links to subscribe and listen to previous episodes on our website at himalmag.com. What we do and what we love doing at Himal is really looking at South Asian literature like no other. And that gives us a very unique community, viewpoint, and the privilege of making conversations like this possible. So if you'd like to help us out, please do become a paying Himal patron. We have a great program with lots of perks, including Himal's Right Side Up map, and we'll welcome you to a fantastic South Asia Review of Books community. Thanks again, and until next time.